Western society has been undergoing something of an awakening in the past few decades. One social movement in particular has been thrust into the public arena with unprecedented speed, one I'm sure you're at least familiar with. This is the mental health justice movement, which aims to give people with all mental illnesses the aid they require while fighting for the rights that they deserve. A prominent factor behind the development of this movement have been discussions of mental illness on social media. The heavily interconnected nature of the platforms allow for people to share their experiences with mental illness, and as a result, greater understanding is broadly achieved about mental health from a wide variety of backgrounds. A natural consequence of this access is a phenomenon known as self-diagnosis, where symptoms are studied via independent research and collaboration, and a diagnosis is reached independent of a psychiatric professional. Perhaps more than any other aspect of the conversation surrounding mental illness, this has been the subject of the most criticism and concern by the psychiatric institution. While it is important to tread with caution to prevent the development of further misinformation and stigma, it is vital that self-diagnosis be recognized as what it is. We will examine this by first seeing the current issues behind social media and self-diagnosis. Second, we will see why self-diagnosis is often useful to people who experience mental illness. And finally, we explore potential solutions to the confusion and conflict surrounding self-diagnosis. First, we see the current issues behind social media and self-diagnosis. An important and irrefutable aspect of any conversation surrounding these topics is the risk of upholding stereotypes, misinformation, and glamorization through efforts to inform and destigmatize. Conversations about mental illness specifically occurring on social media carry an inherent risk and observable reality of uncritical consumption of falsehood and ignorant perpetuation due to the very nature of the platforms. Through this cycle, respectful and serious interpretations of mental illness become less accessible and less understood until they lose all salience. This is only further exacerbated by a growing trend of romanticization that posits mental illness as something desirable or trendy. The goal of destigmatization, however, is not to present mental illness as sets of desirable symptoms, but to present an unvarnished truth of the conditions mentally ill people experience in society, because of the conditions forced upon them, and work to reshape society within that framework. Additionally, the process of self-diagnosing mental illness is much older than social media and exists entirely independent of those platforms in many cases. The self-diagnosis process can be painted in a disingenuous light by its critics, as done by extremely online teenagers who would find a solution to their pathologizing habits in the sunlight and fresh air. This brings me to my second point, where we see why self-diagnosis is often useful to people who experience mental illness. A large reason is that mental health care lacks the infrastructure, funding, and staffing to allow for any kind of useful contact. Another issue is the pervasive social stigma surrounding mental illness, creating a further wedge between the mentally ill and critical mental health care. It may sound possible then to reduce or even eliminate the need for self-diagnosis by improving access to mental health care. But there is an important aspect of mental illness diagnosis that focuses specifically on the validity of psychiatric diagnosis as a medical diagnosis. The purpose of a medical diagnosis is to determine an underlying physical issue that causes the occurrence of a symptom, with methods to reduce or eliminate the impact of that issue. Psychiatry is not a physical medicine in this sense, as very few psychiatric disorders trace to an observable bodily condition. Additionally, psychiatric conditions lack the consistent nature of physical conditions, but the diagnosis system remains much the same, with rigid requirements of symptoms and durations in order for diagnosis to be reached. This diagnosis does not manifest symptoms, and it is vital to understand that the mentally ill are perfectly capable of understanding their own experiences independent of a psychiatrist. Jennifer Moncrief in the journal Social Theory and Health notes the emergence of medically oriented diagnosis as being required for psychiatry to be treated with the same respect as medical professions in the face of many competing theories. Therefore, these systems were constructed into psychiatry in the 1970s to preserve the very nature of the fields, where they had otherwise been absent before. And these systems have not changed in any meaningful way since then. Indeed, mental illness itself can be described as a social construction, based upon unspoken social rules and undesirable behavior, where, with no underlying physical cause, the only difference between a mentally ill and mentally healthy individual is unwanted behaviors. Further strengthening this argument is a comparison between medical and psychiatric treatment. Processes for the former are reliably able to identify and isolate unwanted symptoms, while processes for the latter are almost entirely attempts to change behavior into an acceptable state, using psychoactive methods that, again, do not address any underlying physical cause. In other words, psychiatric diagnosis is a form of control over the mentally ill. So what is to be done? Finally, we explore potential solutions to the confusion and conflict surrounding self-diagnosis. Simply put, psychiatry requires a fundamental change in structure that divorces it entirely from methods of physical diagnosis in order for conditions to be managed in an effective, reasonable way that does not present social desirability as a required threshold for healthiness. Healthcare options are determined by individual preference and need, and not an arbitrarily defined diagnosis that takes definition from supposed deviations in behavior. This framework is similar to the societal model of disability, where disability is caused by society's failure to accommodate needs, and not by a defect that requires curing on the part of the disabled. What this means for self-diagnosis is the full and complete transition of autonomy from a psychiatric institution to the mentally ill, where the meaning of an illness is defined by the person who it pertains to the most, and not a psychiatrist. All this sounds quite abstract. The complete reshaping of society is a goal even loftier than my aspirations to stage at nationals. But change is a power always reserved to the people. Changes at this scale require the efforts of individual people like you and like me, in shaping the course of mental health understanding for generations to come. Seek to learn about mental illness from reputable sources. Listen to the stories of the mentally ill and accept their struggles as genuine and important. Do not force the unwilling in your spheres of influence to accept a psychiatric diagnosis and the entry into a system they may want no part of. Above all, remember that they are human and entitled to autonomy just like you, and are not defined by the impacts of their symptoms. A categorical dismissal of self-diagnosis ignores the important nuance that makes up the issue and its peripheral concepts. Solutions do not lie in the acceptance of some behaviors among the mentally ill, alongside the condemnation of others. Self-diagnosis is an important aspect of giving autonomy back to the mentally ill, in a society that would have them stripped of their rights and voices. We learned this by first, seeing the current issues behind social media and self-diagnosis. Second, we saw why self-diagnosis is often useful to people who experience mental illness. And finally, we explored potential solutions to the confusion and conflict surrounding self-diagnosis. So while movements march onward, and healthcare technology becomes ever more advanced, never forget the important drivers of this change. Those who never chose to see a psychiatrist, who never allowed a label to be forced upon them. Self-diagnosed or no, all of us who experience mental illness will always deserve to be heard.